Now, just to go back very quick as to how New Street got built and why the houses were different and who the original landlords were. This is the 1860 list, map of New Street. Now, if you look at the map as it is here, the line of the railway is here, but this map was drawn before the railway was built. So that line is the outer limit of the town boundary. So it has Railway Terrace in it, but it doesn't have Carragher's and Spence's houses in it, and it doesn't have any of the houses on the other side of the street. And of course, it doesn't have a railway as well. This is it comes from the early Ordnance Survey of the 1830s. And if you notice now, there are 1, 2, a space, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there are 7 houses along Railway Terrace side, right? It's quite obvious that the last 5 are owned by the landlord is the same landlord for those 5 because they're enclosed. And the 2 at the beginning are separate from the other 5. And there's a gap here of a gateway or some sort of an entryway for people to get in. And these are the people who lived in it. The first house on the corner, McGinn's, was William McMahon, and he had a little garden at the back of his house. Jane Levitt lived in number 2. She's a milliner and hat maker in that house. Then there was a bit of a gap. Now the next 5 houses have all been leased from the Hopes by a man called James Devlin. He's their landlord. Now James Devlin started a Delft shop down where Malachy Keenan lives, down in Muckler Street. He then moved in to become an ironmonger. He then began to take land all over the town, and he took a plot there, and he decided to build 5 houses, and then he rented out the 5 houses to 5 different people, and he collected the rents, and he made profit on it. He was a big businessman who was making money. But the 5 people who lived in the 5 houses were William McRoberts, Joseph Reed, John Kiernan, John Griffin, and Charlie Brady. I have no idea who they are. I can't find out anything about them. Jane Levitt is the only one I found out that she was a milliner and dressmaker. This is then coming forward to Laurel Hill House and to Laurel Hill Place. And we have, now the workhouse has been built. You see the huge here. The railway station is here. Laurel Hill is here. And of course, New Street has been broken by the railway, with Railway Terrace on one side and then the other 4 houses on the other side, plus the 2 smaller houses across the road. And this is about 1860, 65.
No convent then, that's it, no?
The house is, there's a house there, but there's no big convent. No. Convent is much later. Now, when you get the original Ordnance Survey map, it's quite interesting. Well, the railway station obviously is there, that when you come up from Main Street, you see that there are 2 houses, right? And then there's like a gateway here before James Devlin's 5 houses then appear. And then they put the railway along the boundary of the town, and where the 3 houses are today, there are 4 houses in the 1860s. There's 2 where Carragher's were, smaller, say half the size of the present house, but there's still 2 big houses here, Dr. Duffy's and Spence's. And the Spence house had a lot of land to it. Now, if you look here at number 3, this is the 4 houses above the railway line. Now, George Carragher lived in the first house. That's the first half of Terrace. I don't think he's related to you, is he, Jeremy? You never heard of George? Well, George Carragher anyways lived in that house. I found out nothing about George.
No, we always refer to Daddy as George, but I have no idea.
All right, yeah, maybe for that reason. Now, all George Carragher had here was a house, and he's got a wee backyard, that's all. Beside him is a man called James McGinty, and he's just got a little house. But in the middle house is the Reverend Thomas Middlemas, and he's not only got a backyard, he also has this garden to himself as well. So Reverend Middlemas is doing very well for himself. Now, the Reverend Middlemas was the minister in Frankfurt Presbyterian Church out the Orem Road, the church. And Thomas Middlemas came to town because the minister who was already there, a Reverend Coulter, George Coulter, had gotten very old. And Middlemas was now there to assist him and eventually took over as the minister at Frankfurt. He married Coulter's daughter, Jane, and they lived initially in what we call Killycard Cottage, up the Mile Hill Road, which has been knocked down quite recently, I see. And then he moves into this big house in the town and then commutes out to Frankfurt to do his ministry at Frankfurt Presbyterian Church. Himself and Jane are married there, and then Jane gets very sick and she dies. And on her deathbed, and this is a story told to me about one of the Middlemas descendants who was in the town a few years ago, that his wife said, "If I die, would you marry my best friend, Margaret Smith, who lived in the Ballymacmanus?" Now, not the Smiths, P.J. Smith, but a different Smith family who ran the coach business on the corner there. So anyway, Jane dies and he marries her best friend. And they then decide to emigrate, and they head off to America, Thomas and his wife. And they go to Michigan, and maybe I've told this before, they go to a town that I've only ever heard of once before I found out where Thomas Middlemas went to. And it's a town that's mentioned in a Paul Simon song, the song America. The line in the song is, "It took me 4 days to hitchhike from Saginaw." He ended up in Saginaw, Michigan. And he became the minister and was minister there for 50 years. And there are Middlemases all over Saginaw today, descended from Thomas from Catsleblayney. Now, why they disappeared quickly, I don't know. I have a question mark over that story, because on the headstone down in Frankfurt Presbyterian Church, it says Jane Coulter. It doesn't call her Jane Middlemas. If she was married to him, she should be. She didn't get her married name on the headstone. I don't know. There's a funny story behind that somewhere. Anyway, Thomas ended up in Saginaw. And the last house, Thomas Malloy, and that photograph you had, Patricia, is the same Malloy family. They had the big house, big shop in the main street. Eventually they moved across here to P.J. Ward's B&B across the street here, but they lived in that house for a while as well, and Thomas Malloy is there. Now, if you look at number 1, you'll see that Laurel Hill House, which is at the top of the hill, not the convent, the old convent, we'll call it that if you like, is owned by Andrew McMath. And Andrew is the manager of the Belfast Bank in the main street, what is now the Allied Irish Bank. And he doesn't live in Laurel Hill House. He had a big house out the Carrick Road called Anvil. Does you know that one? The vet lived there, what do you call it? Rush, is it? They lived out there. And Andrew's brother Hamilton owned the big mill at Ahadreenan, that's out at Burnfield. And between Andrew and Hamilton, they were the landlords to the whole of the parish of Dunamine and the whole of the parish of Annamullen. They leased the land from the big landlords and then subleased them. And Andrew made fortunes, the two of them. And Andrew then bought Laurel Hill House at the top, but never lived in it. He rented it out to the man who's number B on the list, Henderson Pearce. And Henderson Pearce was the cashier in the Belfast Bank. So he's rented out his house to the man who works for him in the bank. And Henderson was in town a long time and had a son called John who became a solicitor in the town and was a solicitor for quite a number of years. Now the other people, Anne Burns, Michael MacDonald, Philomena Flanagan and Felix Shevlin, either live in the houses across the street. This is where Mary lives. But there appear to be 4 houses over there, not 2 as it is today. There would have been 4 small houses. And I assume they are people who worked on Laurel Hill, a farmer maybe, because there's a bit of farming to be done. There's 12 or 14 acres there, and there would have been a lot of work to be done, and I think they were employed by whoever lived in the big house at the top of the hill. You'll also notice, just inside the gates of Laurel, this is the main gate to the convent as it is today. There's a wee gate lodge here, right? which is no longer there. It's just between the gate and the grotto and on the left there. And somebody is living in that as well. And that's New Street above the railway line, shall we say, known as Laurel Hill House. Now, Laurel Hill, so that's 1860s. That's the Griffiths valuation. Right? Now, Laurel Hill, at the top of the hill on the left-hand side, is where Canon Morris used to live. Kellett's, is it Kellett's still there? Yeah, Kellett's live, and there's now a bungalow in there. That's Laurel Hill House. And in 1792, a man called William Henry, the Henrys are everywhere, Henrys of Henry Street, and William Lewis, who was from Enniskillen originally, came to Catsleblayney as a merchant, were given a lease on what was known as the Brew House. Now, the Brew House is the brewery, okay? But there must have been a brew house there before these two men took it over, because it's known as the Brew House. And it's described as 13 acres with plantation, lying south of the Great Road from Catsleblayney to Ballybay. Now, the Great Road from Catsleblayney to Ballybay is the Mile Hill Road. Right? That's the shortest way today to Ballybay. Just go up the Mile Hill Road and keep going straight, you come to Ballybay eventually. And the south of it is this side, is the convent side of the road. They were also given 1 rood and 30 perch on the northern side of the road, the other side of the road from the convent. And that's the field that Paddy Donnelly's house is. You know, the Donnellys and the Havens all live in that little field that runs down the hill along the road. That was part of the brewery site. In 1891, they gave the lease back to Lord Blayney and they continued at the beer, right? But they stopped beer in the 1840s, particularly when the railway came, because now you could import McArdle's beer from Dundalk and you could import. Now, the boys who were working in the brewery up there, and when they made the beer, and I'll explain the moment where all the beer went to, sold it mainly in the town and possibly to surrounding shops. Didn't have pubs as we might know them today, but they made the beer, and it was the best beer that was ever made in Ireland ever. At least that's the advertising slogan. Okay, just to go on to explain who owned Laurel Hill House before the nuns got it. In the 1840s, a man called John Maudsley lived in it. He was a retired, investor of some sort, and at one stage he called it Maudsley Lee, changing the name of it, but that never caught on. It always remains Laurel Hill. In 1861, Henderson Pearce is in it, and he's the cashier in the bank. The 1870s and 1880s, a man called John Callan lives in it, and John Callan was the engineer responsible for putting the waterworks into the town, putting all the lead pipes under the streets and running water and building the waterworks out the road and all that sort of stuff. So he's a big businessman with plenty of money, and he's living in Laurel Hill House. Now, after John Callan sells the house, it's bought by the Gilmores. Samuel Gilmore was a doctor, originally from Crossmaglen, from Cregan. Became a doctor in Edinburgh for a while, then opened up a business in Muckman Street, the upper end of Muckman Street here, where the coffee shop is, and then moved across here to P.J. Ward's house on the opposite side of the street here, and he was a doctor there for years. He had a wife and a daughter, and then he died, and after he died, his wife bought Laurel Hill House, and the Gilmores moved up to Laurel Hill and lived in Laurel Hill to 1905. Old Mrs. Gilmore died. The daughter married a solicitor from Cavan Town and moved away to Cavan, so the site then became available, and the nuns, our parish priest bought it and gave it then to the Mercy nuns, and it becomes the convent after Miss Gilmore. Now, Miss Gilmore also had a field down behind Carraher's, Terry Carraher's, Terrace is, where the telephone exchange is, in the back of the junior school up there, which Miss Gilmore allowed the people of the town to use, and it was known as the athletic field, right? And the Catsleblayney Hockey Club played all their games in that field. It's a very handy field because visiting teams would come by railway and only had to jump off the train at the railway station and walk in. You can jump off the train and into the field. And the photograph of the Catsleblayney hockey team, which I didn't take, was taken at Laurel Hill, right? And they played quite a number of games there in the 1890s. Then the soccer team decided to use it as well. So the Catsleblayney soccer team, up until about 1903-04, used Miss Gilmore's field at the bottom of the hill. And the soccer, possibly the photograph of the famous one of our soccer team, was taken on Laurel Hill as well. And it was known as the Athletic Grounds, easy access from the town. Then the Gilmores leave and the nuns take over, and the nuns do what all nuns definitely should do, the switch to it being a GAA pitch, right? And the Fogs take it over as their first ever field. And they're playing along the railway line there. And all of their early games were played in that field, including the county final of 1907, the first championship they ever won, was done in that field. A problem arose in 1908 because the Ulster Council fixed the Monaghan Armagh Ulster Championship game for that field. And there was a serious problem because the money that was collected at the gate didn't match the number of people who were in the field watching the game. There were too many holes around the back, and all the Blaney people knew where all the gaps were. So they were all getting in free, and the Ulster Council decided not to use the field anymore. The Fogs then moved to the field, the car park behind the Glencairn Hotel. Then they moved out to Smithsfield at the Carrick Road, then up to Carrahurst Field, where the Crescent is today, before going to Concra and then to where they are at the moment. That field at the back of Terrace is also where the first ever game of camogie was played in Catsleblayney. And there's a great description in one of the papers of the men watching the game and the females screaming and waving sticks and all the sorts of. The first ever camogie game was played on Miss Gilmore's land. But the GAA didn't get the field till after Miss Gilmore had gone.
What
Right.
year did they move to Guayana?
Sorry?
What year did the football field?
53.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. They've been all over the place. And that was Miss Gilmore. Now, just to explain how the beer worked, the beer, of course, had to be made locally. We didn't have a railway in 1792. So people had to bring barley into the town, store it, then prepare it, ferment it. Now, I don't know how to make beer, but there's hops and all sorts of stuff, and if people know how to make beer, they'll explain to me sometime, but you have to ferment it and so on to make the alcohol. And the first shed that Mr. Lures built is this one here in front of the photograph with the red roof on it. See this one? Now that is at the back of Terry's house down in the square here. And you get to it by going down Levy's gateway. You know, it's now the optician Levy's. That was the entrance, and you went down the side there and around. Now that beautiful building to the left, you see it with the chimney on it? Mm-hmm. That was the Petty Sessions house at one stage, and there's a photograph of it in those books on your way in if you want to see it. And there's a fireplace in it, and the Petty Sessions courts were held in that building. And there's steps up to the door, and people used to sit on the steps and they get called in, and the judge had been there, you know, no light on your bicycle and all, whatever it was. Small things, not major court cases or anything like that, just very small cases. Unfortunately, and Terry can tell me, it fell down recently. Is that right, Terry? Is Terry there now? That building has fallen down, as are all the buildings down there. But the one now with the red tin roof on it is in Nurse Duffy's back garden, right? And it was where they stored the barley. Now, when you look at it closely, you will see there's a marvellous wooden floor about 4 feet off the ground here, inside, right? And the door at the side is about 4 feet up off the ground. And the reason why the floor is raised off the ground is to keep the barley dry. So they stored the barley in there in the bags. They also had a fireplace, and they blew warm air in under the floor, keeping the barley dry. Because it gets wet and gets warm to germinate, and you wanted it as dry as possible. And that was the grain store for the brewery. And then when you came to make your beer, they came down here with their carts and took out a few bags of barley, loaded them in the carts, took them up Levy's Gateway, and up they went up the main street. And they went up to New Street, to Mary Hollywood's house. That's where the 4 little buildings were. And that was called the mash house. This is here, right? Now the mash house means they had a big vat, they put the barley into it, then they added the water and the yeast and hops and whatever else you add to make beer, and they would have stirred it up. And that's where the whole stirring and the making of the mash took place. Again, labour intensive, okay? And you will notice right up here at the top of the hill, see it here, is the brewery well. And that's where the senior citizens' houses. Is there still a well there? No? There is? Yeah, the well was there anyway. And you notice from the main road, the wee steps. This is a great map, this one. You see the small steps, there were small steps down to the well. And the water from that well was taken down to the mash house to make the beer. It was where the water came from. But they didn't bring it down the road, they piped it to the hedge at the back of that field, and the pipe ran, or a drain, whatever it was, ran the whole way down the back of Heavens' houses, those new houses, and then turned here and turned into the mash house, and the water then was pure spring water, straight out of the ground, straight into the big vats, and stirred in with the barley and the hops or whatever else they had in the thing. And then you wait a few days for the whole thing to ferment. Then you had to lift all the vats and bring them across the road and up to the house up at the top, up to Laurel Hill House. This is the mash house here. Well, it's 2 separate houses today. And I assume the mash house is only a single-storey house. It's been knocked down a long time ago. And wherever the drain was, it went down the backs of those houses. And the well is at the top of the hill, was at the top of the hill. And this is the brewery itself, right, up at the convent. And when you go in here, now you will see there's been a lot of changes to these buildings. You can see a window in the top floor, right, and the windows in the top floor are much bigger, they're much smaller now. All the windows are much smaller than they were originally. And it was into this building they brought the big vats full of this mash. And then they heated it up in the kip horn until the beer was made. Now they made beer, of course, 3 times. They fermented it once, took off the liquid, the beer, when it was ready to drink, and put it into wooden casks, which they took down to the pubs down the town, right? Then they put more water in, they filled it back up again with water and did a second run, which wasn't as alcoholic as the first run. And then when they'd taken off the second beer, they filled it up with water again, and they did a third fermenting. And the third beer was called small beer, because it was basically non-alcoholic. And it was used by people who were out working in the fields. If you were thirsty, you could drink this small beer, and you wouldn't get drunk. It was useful to have. But the pubs down the town, of course, got the Triple X beer, which is the worst one, And then when they took the casks down to the pubs down the town, they hammered a tap into they tapped the barrels, and they took the beer out, and people then drank it. It wasn't bottled originally. It would have been just taken straight out of the wooden barrels, okay? And each pub would have taken their beer from here. An odd pub, smaller pubs, had a beer woman in the yard at the back of the pub who made beer in tiny little quantities to save them having to buy the good beer from Mr. Lures at the top of the hill. Now, eventually, of course, they used green glass bottles, but the beer wasn't bottled up here. It was bottled by the publicans when they got the barrels. And then you could buy a bottle of beer and you were charged a penny extra, and then when you brought the bottle back, they washed out and kept reusing the same bottles. You always got a deposit when you took your beer bottle back to the pub. And of course, that thick bottled glass is very harsh. And if the glass did break, it was dangerous to have it lying about, broken glass, because a lot of children ran about in bare feet, and people, was got. So it was very important if somebody who could pick up all the broken bits of glass, and bottles in particular. And the bottles was then taken by a cart and brought up to Killycart and buried in the ground up there in a place known as the Bottley Lane. And at the end of the Bottley Lane is where all the broken bottles were dumped, apparently, and that's why it's called the Bottley Lane. Some people may not know the Bottley Lane, but it's still up there, right? And it came here. Now, this is a second picture of the brewery. Big enough building, and a lot of brewing going on. You imagine the number of people here who are working at these things. It's a good industry around the town. This is the back of it, and again, a couple of the windows have been changed, but it's still solid enough building there at the moment, and this is what it looks like inside today, I think. I don't know if it's been done up since I took that photograph, but this is the inside of the brewery. Now, that building is the building that was used as the first national school when the nuns came to the town first. This was their school before any of the other buildings were put up. And you will notice that the windows, particularly in this lower half, were made into big windows, probably when it was a school, but then at some stage they've closed them up again. It does change a lot. And this was Laurel Hill House. And it's long gone. It's a beautiful house, right? It faces down the town, so when you stood at the front door and looked out, you could see a whole town spread out before you, and Mullyash in the distance. Two-storey, built, I'm assuming, by Andrew McMath in the 1840s or 1850s. In a minute I'll explain how it was used as a convent. But Hamilton Pierce used it was his private house, John Callan's private house, and Miss Gilmore's private house. I still think it was one of the most beautiful houses in the town. And the one thing that gets me about it is the windows are very big. It must have been a lot of light in it, a very bright house inside. That's Laurel Hill House, was at the top of Laurel Hill. You entered, if you were posh, where the gates are at the moment, and there were two paths. One went along the wall and one went up past where the conduit is today, and you went in that way. There was also a tradesman's entrance. It's past the brewery at the back, right? It would have been a posher house. I think it's a fabulous looking house. And then in 1905, the Sisters of Mercy come to the town, right? And they don't obviously build houses initially, but build schools, initially. They keep using the thing. Now, there is a book, and unfortunately the branch here doesn't have a copy of it. Some people probably have a copy of it. You've all seen this one. It was done by the nuns in 2005. I don't know how many copies are still around the town. It's called What's 100 Years? And it explains the convent and how the convent worked. It has a great description of the first day the nuns came to the town. Now, they arrived in the town and they intended to come on Sunday the 24th of September, I think, which was the Feast of Our Lady of Mercy, which was their patron saint. But there were no trains, so they didn't come then until the Monday. So they're in the town. Canon Megan comes down and he says a mass at 7 o'clock, and he blesses the house, and they get the house ready, and it started as a convent. There were 5 nuns: Mother Aloysius, Sister Mercy, Sister DeSale, Sister Margaret, and Sister Bridget. And it goes on to describe what they did the first day and how everything was done. They also explain the schools and the 4 first girls to go into the schools. One was the first 5 pupils, all girls of course, Baby Duffy, and Baby Duffy was Cormac Duffy's daughter in what was Peter Flanagan's pub there, and what's called now Foxes or something. She lived there, and she was the first student to attend the convent national school. Now, she also in the 1920s played a leading role in the War of Independence in the town, was very involved in the IRA, and possibly even did a bit of shooting herself. And she's the one who did up the bodies of the 2 McEnany boys when they were taken in from Canada. She did them up and cleaned them and got them ready for burial. And she's also the woman who took in Paddy McKenna from Drumcarra, where he was shot, and did him up, and they buried him secretly one night up in the graveyard, right? And that was her. And she was in the town for many, many years. The other next people who came in was Florrie Corrigan, who is the grandmother of McMahon's of the Square that she's one of those Corrigans. Now, Florrie Corrigan, I also think, is one of the girls in that photograph that has been painted on the gable wall in York Street when she was going to the beach corner, which is where the girls went initially. The beach corner was both boys and girls. And then she's one of the first students into the convent national school. And there's great reading in this if you ever give it a copy. I'm not giving you this copy of it. And Louise here in the library says she'll try and get a copy anyone who wants to read it. Tony Donnelly gives a great description because Tony's grandmother lived in Laurel Hill House. They didn't have access to the whole house. There was, I think, a piano room where the nuns would give piano lessons downstairs. You remember? You went there. Sheila went there. And upstairs, a couple of the rooms were set aside for the nuns' private luggage trunks and things like that. And Tony would, I remember telling the story, and he tells it here as well, that a week before the nuns went on their holidays to Bundoran, all the trunks had to be taken down and cleaned out and then packed and ready to be taken to Bundoran and then brought down to the railway station. And Tony was saying not only did they put their clothes and everything else that they needed, but vegetables, tomatoes, eggs and potatoes, which were grown in the convent grounds, were put into these big trunks. And he said it was a whole week's work getting the trunks down, packing them, getting them to the railway station, and then when they came back, taking them back and emptying them and putting them back upstairs for their trip to Bundoran the following year. And a lot of other people are interviewed in this, and there's great photographs of schools. I presume you have one of them shared anyway. Most girls in the town, the photograph must be in that. It's the history of the convent, right? And hopefully it'll be in the branch library here if they can round up a copy of it. Now, this of course becomes the primary, the infant school and the girls' school into it. We all did I did my 3 years there, actually did 4 years there, as we did. The school is, by the way, called, those of you who all attended it, what's the name of the school? It's St. Mildites, which is written on the wee plaque on the side of the building if you go up sometime and look at it. It's St. Mildites Primary School, but its name has never been used. That is the name that was put on it. Then, of course, we had the second building, which was added, the community school, but it became the secondary school at one stage, and a lot of the girls here, the females would have gone to it. And it's still there, of course. And then the main building itself, built about 1910 to 1912, and unfortunately it's empty today, and I don't know if there's any use that's been made of it. Again, it's another big building in the town that somebody needs to decide what to do with it.
Is that the chapel?
Sorry? The chapel's in at the back of that, yes. Now, the chapel is a much more recent building. The chapel wasn't built in the early 1940s, I think. It's in that book, the date for it. Now, the chapel is a fabulous building. There it is there, right? It's around the side, okay? And most people here, we all serve Mass in it, and we know about the chapel. And inside the chapel, there are 5 fabulous stained glass windows, of which at least 2, if not 3, are Harry Clark's. And therefore must be worth tens of thousands, would it be? The one thing about Harry, I don't know much about stained glass windows, right? Some fellow was writing somewhere in these and called them stainless glass windows. Anyway, stained glass windows. The ones with the good blue in them are the Harry Clark. He's famous for his blue colours. And these are the 5 windows. The last one, I think, is a Harry Clark. You see the strong blue. Usually that's a sign that it's a Harry Clark. Somebody told me 3 of them were Clarks, and someone else said 2 of them are. I don't know. But definitely the blue in that last one, and the one above it up here, have those Harry Clark sort of colours. The one with the Queen of Heaven on the left-hand side probably isn't, but it has a wee bit of blue at the top. And that's the inside of the convent chapel, right? Beautiful building, and hopefully somebody will think of something to do with that big building plus the chapel, and we can eventually get it. In 1905, I read the list of the 5 nuns who were in the convent. Mother Aloysius, Sister Mercy de Sales, Margaret and Bridget. They were the first 5 nuns to come from Enniskillen on that morning in September 1905, and started the whole process. The next list is the 1938 electoral list. Of course, none has been over 21, they can all vote. There's a lot of names here. I put Bernadine at the top, but I think that should actually be Bernadette, is a different nun. That was my mistake, I think. You go on down and you'll see Columba, Finbar, we all remember, Imelda, Michael, DeSale, they're all Philomene and so on. I think there's something like 25 of them there. Sister Bernard, is she on that? No, she's in one of the other ones as well. Sorry? Now, some of these, of course, would have been fairly old nuns by 1938 and gone before our time. Sister Declan isn't on it. I was too young for that one. And some of them would have worked in the county home. Some were teachers in the schools, and then some were just all. The only thing that always got me is I can't imagine being in a building where 25 women are living permanently together. I don't think they would gossip much, would they? Right. This was the photograph I took out of the book of them in their little. Each had their individual kneeler in the chapel. Mother Joseph, Columba, Vincent, and then we heard of Kieran, Delurde, Ursula, of course, Pius, Declan, Baptista, Bernadine is in this one, and Bernard is in it as well. And there's a lot of good photographs in that book at any stage, if you can get a copy of it. What's 100 Years, it's called. No. This is one of the finest pieces of architecture and so on in the town, the gates. And again, put about 1910, 1915 of that period. Lovely limestone. There's lovely designs on the stonework. And the double stonework, the idea that you have a main gate, but you have 2 pedestrian gates coming in on either side. And the wrought iron work, which is done in the gates. Very soon, of course, people are going to decide that buses won't fit in here. We have to knock them all down in order to fit buses in and build another car park in the town, which is necessary. The wee lodge was to the left there, but there's no sign, but it's completely disappeared.